The Pacific, 1943. Morning settles over the jungle without warning, heavy with moisture and silence. An American infantry unit occupies a thin stretch of ground only briefly long enough to listen, to sense movement beyond the trees, to confirm that the enemy is close. Contact comes suddenly, sharp and incomplete. A few shots, a test, not an assault. And then, almost as soon as it begins, the Americans begin to move. There is no hesitation, no conference of officers unfolding over maps. A radio is lifted, a voice speaks. The transmission is short, precise, and immediate. New coordinates, a new direction, a new task. Within moments, the unit abandons its position and disappears into the terrain, leaving behind nothing but disturbed foliage and uncertainty. Elsewhere, far from the gunfire, Japanese signal intercept operators are listening. Their equipment performs flawlessly. The signal is strong, the frequency is clean, every sound is captured. The operators hear English but not English as they know it. The cadence is unfamiliar. The structure resists parsing. It does not resemble any known cipher traffic. There are no numerical anchors, no repetitions to isolate, no patterns to seize. Cipher books are opened anyway. Pages are turned. Tables are consulted. Nothing aligns. Analysts assume the message is incomplete, or that some mechanical encryption layer has been missed. They replay the recording, slowing it down, dissecting syllables. But the more closely they listen, the less it behaves like a code. It sounds conversational, fluid, almost improvised. And yet, it produces precise military movement. By the time any hypothesis forms, the message has lost all value. The coordinates describe an empty location. The instructions point to soldiers already gone. Before conclusions can be passed up the chain of command, another transmission cuts through the air, another relocation, another shift in posture. The Americans have moved again. For generations, secrecy had governed warfare. Messages were hidden, delayed, protected by layers of mathematics and machinery. Interception was power, if one could only break the lock. But here, the lock is irrelevant. The Americans are not concealing their intent. They are simply moving faster than intent can be understood. In the Pacific heat, a quiet disruption takes shape. Speed has begun to replace secrecy. And the men listening do not yet understand that this was not an accident but the opening signal of a weapon they have never encountered before. Japanese signals intelligence had been trained to recognize order in noise. Across the Pacific, receivers now captured American transmissions with increasing frequency, logged carefully by time, location, and signal strength. On paper, everything appeared routine, but when the recordings were replayed, certainty began to dissolve. The speech did not behave as expected. It was not English as taught in classrooms or heard in propaganda broadcasts. The rhythm was uneven, the intonation unfamiliar. Consonants clustered in ways that defied prediction. Vowels rose and fell as if carrying meaning beyond their sound. Operators noted the anomaly and passed the material to linguists, confident that classification would follow. It did not. Phonetic breakdowns were attempted first. Individual sounds were isolated, compared, catalogued, some syllables repeated, but never reliably. Others appeared only once, never to return. The language offered no foothold, no obvious grammar, no recognizable structure to map. Each attempt to reduce it to components only revealed further complexity. More troubling still, meaning seemed unstable. A phrase that appeared to signal movement in one context seemed to indicate supply in another. Commands appeared to transform as they were spoken, as if shaped by tone or timing rather than fixed definition. Analysts searched for encryption layers hidden within speech, convinced the surface language was a mask. But there was no mask. Unlike mechanical codes, this system did not repeat itself. It did not rely on static substitutions or numerical keys. There were no patterns to exhaust, no cycles to observe. The language adapted moment to moment, alive to circumstance, immune to the assumptions of cryptanalysis. It behaved less like a machine and more like a conversation, responsive, fluid, resistant to reduction. For Japanese intelligence, interception had always implied advantage. To hear was to know. To record was to prepare. Now, for the first time, listening produced nothing but frustration. Every captured message arrived intact and useless. Every successful intercept yielded no tactical clarity. The unsettling conclusion crept in quietly. The Americans were speaking freely, directly, and without apparent fear of being understood. Whatever system guided their words did not collapse under scrutiny. It seemed to grow stronger beneath it. Somewhere within these voices was a method untouched by interception. And until it could be named, it would remain beyond reach, an unseen force moving American units with confidence while their enemy listened, helpless, to every word. On the surface, it looked like ordinary radio traffic. A handset lifted, a brief exchange, a set of instructions carried through static and humidity. But as the campaign in the Pacific widened, Japanese commanders began to notice a pattern that could not be plotted on a map. American units were reacting faster than an enemy should be able to react. An intercept might be made at 0900. By 0910, the position described was already empty. A fire mission would be anticipated, only to arrive on coordinates the Americans had abandoned minutes earlier. In jungles and on ridgelines, the battlefield itself seemed to lag behind American decision-making, as if their orders were traveling ahead of time. The usual explanations were examined first. If a new cipher machine had been introduced, it might explain the confusion. Some device compact enough to travel with infantry, robust enough to survive salt, air, moisture, shock, but no such machines were seen. Captured equipment yielded nothing beyond standard radios, field gear, and the familiar debris of movement. There were no mechanical keys to steal, no rotors to replicate, no wires to trace back to a method. So attention turned to paper. In war, secrets often leave evidence. Codebooks are carried, guarded, replaced when compromised. They can be lost in retreats, seized in raids, pulled from bodies. Japanese intelligence searched for that weakness, expecting time to do what battle often does: scatter documents, expose routines, create mistakes. But nothing surfaced. No notebooks, no cipher sheets, no standardized tables. The system appeared to exist only in the air, vanishing the moment it was spoken. For analysts trained to break what can be captured, this was more than frustration. It was a structural problem. How do you steal a key that is never written down? In the absence of physical proof, a comfortable assumption began to take hold. The Americans must be improvising. Perhaps their radio discipline had collapsed under jungle pressure. Perhaps messages were being passed in plain speech, relying on speed and chaos rather than method. Improvisation, after all, has no design to decode. But that assumption carried its own danger, because what sounded unstructured was, in reality, disciplined. What seemed casual was controlled. The system was not the absence of encryption, it was encryption of a different kind, one that disguised precision as simplicity, and made intelligence work feel like chasing smoke. The war was revealing a hidden layer of modern combat, not just the movement of men and machines, but the movement of meaning itself, compressed, accelerated, and carried by voices that left no trace behind. And the deeper Japan searched for the missing codebook, the more it failed to see the unsettling truth. The code was not on paper at all. It was inside the men speaking. Imperial Japanese intelligence did not enter the Pacific War unprepared. Its officers were trained in a worldview shaped by mathematics, engineering, and precedent. Codes, as they understood them, were problems to be solved, structures built from logic, weakened by repetition, and ultimately vulnerable to disciplined analysis. Every secure system, they believed, contained a flaw waiting to be discovered. Encryption was therefore treated as a technical discipline. Machines could be studied, tables could be reconstructed. Even the most complex cipher, once identified, could be reduced to equations and probability. The work required patience, resources, and time, but not imagination. Success depended on skill, not surprise. Japan possessed skilled cryptanalysts. Many had proven themselves against foreign systems before the war, breaking diplomatic and naval codes through careful traffic analysis and statistical insight. These successes reinforced a powerful assumption: no communication system was truly unbreakable. Some only required more effort than others. Language itself was not considered an obstacle. Once identified, it was assumed to be transparent, merely a carrier for meaning, not a defense in its own right. If a transmission was spoken rather than encoded, it was regarded as exposed by definition. Words could be translated, grammar could be mapped, sound could always be reduced to structure. This belief narrowed the field of inquiry. Human factors, Memory, culture, instinct, adaptability were treated as noise rather than strength. They were variables to be eliminated, not leveraged. Codes were supposed to remove the human element, replacing it with machines and procedures that could be standardized and measured. Anything else felt primitive, unreliable, and ultimately inferior. Experience seemed to confirm this worldview. Again and again, intercepted systems yielded under sustained pressure. Patterns emerged. Shortcuts were discovered. Confidence grew quietly, not through arrogance alone, but through repetition. When a method works often enough, it becomes doctrine. And doctrine, once fixed, resists contradiction. So when American radio traffic defied interpretation, the failure was not immediately attributed to a new idea, but to a temporary gap in understanding. Analysts assumed the problem lay in incomplete data, insufficient samples, or an undiscovered mechanical layer. They searched harder within the same framework, convinced that persistence would eventually expose the solution. What they did not question was the framework itself. They did not consider that a code might reject mathematics entirely. That language could be shaped into a weapon without becoming a cipher. That meaning could be protected not by obscurity, but by cultural depth and speed beyond calculation. This was the blind spot. By assuming all codes were technical, Japanese intelligence confined itself to technical answers. And as the war pressed on, that certainty, once a strength, became a liability. Analysis continued, confident and precise, even as it drifted further from the truth. Because the most dangerous belief in intelligence is not ignorance. It is the conviction that you already understand how the enemy thinks. Japanese signals intelligence had long excelled at listening not just to messages, but to their movement. Even when words were obscured, traffic itself told a story. Frequency, volume, timing, these were the quiet signatures of intent. An increase in transmission suggested preparation. A sudden silence hinted at movement. Patterns, once identified, could be trusted to reveal what language concealed. This method had worked before, repeatedly. Across earlier campaigns, traffic analysis exposed naval concentrations, operational pauses, and impending offensives. It required no translation, only patience and comparison, meaning, it was believed, always left a shadow, and if one studied the shadow closely enough, the object casting it would come into view. But as American radio traffic multiplied across the Pacific, those shadows began to disappear. Logs filled with data that refused to align. Bursts of communication appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly. There were no gradual build-ups, no predictable cycles. Units transmitted, moved, and fell silent before analysts could assemble a coherent picture. The flow of information felt fragmented, almost impulsive. Speed was the disruptor. Orders traveled faster than observation could stabilize them. By the time a pattern was suspected, it had already shifted. What analysts recorded at dawn bore no relation to the battlefield by midday, meaning no longer lingered long enough to be studied. It slipped through the cracks between intercept and interpretation. Worse still, context refused to hold. A spike in communication might precede an advance or a withdrawal or nothing at all. Silence could mean concealment or simply completion. Without repetition, assumptions collapsed. Without duration, certainty evaporated. To trained analysts, this instability suggested weakness. Randomness, in intelligence doctrine, was often read as failure, poor discipline, rushed procedures, or a system under strain. Analysts concluded that American communications lacked rigor, that speed had come at the cost of structure. They believed that with enough data, order would eventually reassert itself. They were wrong. The system was not chaotic. It was intentionally compressed. Meaning was delivered precisely, then discarded. Messages were not designed to endure scrutiny. They were designed to expire. In this design, speed was not a byproduct, it was the defense itself. Japanese intelligence continued to listen faithfully. Interception rates remained high. Technical performance was never in question. But the value of interception declined steadily, battle by battle, until listening itself became an act without consequence. This was the misjudgment. They assumed that what could not be measured was fragile, that what moved too quickly must be unsound. They did not yet grasp that the Americans had inverted the problem entirely, building a communication system whose strength lay not in what it revealed over time, but in how little time it allowed revelation to occur. And somewhere beyond the listening posts and analysis rooms, a quiet realization was forming on the American side that speed had crossed a threshold. It was no longer an advantage. It was becoming dominance. The problem confronting American planners was not secrecy alone. By 1942, the US military possessed capable encryption devices and established procedures for secure communication. What they lacked, especially in the Pacific, was time. Jungle fighting, amphibious landings, and rapidly shifting fronts demanded decisions measured in seconds, not minutes. Mechanical encryption could protect messages, but it imposed delay. Field ciphers required setup, verification, and careful transcription. Under fire, those steps became liabilities. A message that arrived perfectly secure, but too late, was functionally useless. The battlefield was moving faster than the machines designed to protect it. This realization forced a quiet shift in priorities. Absolute secrecy gave way to something more pragmatic: speed. Communications did not need to be unbreakable forever. They needed to survive long enough to matter. If an enemy could intercept a message but only after its value had expired, the objective was achieved. Within this context, an unconventional idea resurfaced, one that had circulated briefly, then been set aside as impractical. It did not involve new hardware or complex engineering, it involved people. Specifically, it proposed using a language unknown to the enemy, spoken fluently by a small number of Americans, and adaptable enough to describe modern war. The proposal carried risk. Language was human. Humans made mistakes. Unlike machines, they could not be standardized, reset, or replaced easily. There would be no physical safeguards, no written references, no fallback system if comprehension failed. If the enemy learned the language, the entire concept would collapse instantly. Yet, the risk was accepted, not publicly, not with fanfare. The approval came quietly, through memoranda and limited trials. There were no grand announcements, no claims of innovation. It was treated as an experiment, useful if it worked, forgettable if it did not. What mattered was that it promised speed without machinery. Messages could be spoken as quickly as they were conceived. No encoding delay, no decoding apparatus. Communication would move at the pace of thought. That simplicity was its greatest strength and its greatest uncertainty. The system would rely entirely on memory, discipline, and trust. There would be no paper trail for intelligence to trace, no captured device to examine. Success would depend on individuals performing flawlessly under pressure, again and again, without recognition and without error. In adopting this approach, American planners stepped outside conventional doctrine. They chose adaptability over orthodoxy and human complexity over mechanical certainty. It was a calculated gamble, taken not because it was elegant, but because the battlefield demanded it. As the war intensified, the experiment moved forward quietly, embedded within units, rarely discussed beyond those who depended on it. The enemy would hear its effects long before they understood its cause. And far from the front lines, in places few military planners ever visited, the living instrument of this experiment was about to be recruited, bringing with it a language that would never be written down. The solution, once approved, demanded a kind of recruitment the Marine Corps had never attempted before. Not for strength alone, or marksmanship, or endurance, but for language. Quietly, the search began for men who spoke Navajo fluently, not as a subject studied, but as a way of life carried since childhood. Many of those selected had never left their homeland. They came from a landscape of mesas, deserts, and long distances measured more by memory than by maps. For some, military service itself was a first encounter with the wider world. They arrived at training camps carrying two forms of knowledge: the discipline of a recruit and a language few outside their communities had ever heard spoken. Navajo was not simply unfamiliar, it was structurally resistant to intrusion. Tonal, highly contextual, and without a traditional written form, it relied on sound, rhythm, and shared understanding. Meaning could shift with emphasis. Concepts could be layered rather than stated directly. For foreign listeners, even those trained in linguistics, it offered no obvious entry point. This complexity was not engineered for war, it was inherited. To make it usable on the battlefield, adaptation was required. Modern warfare demanded words for tanks, aircraft, artillery, and coordinated fire concepts with no direct equivalents. Rather than inventing terms mechanically, The speakers drew on metaphor. Objects were described through familiar images. A tank became a turtle, a bomber, a bird. These associations were logical within the language, yet opaque to anyone outside it. Crucially, nothing was written down. Every new term was memorized. Every substitution rehearsed aloud. There were no manuals to issue, no charts to consult, no reference sheets to lose. Accuracy depended on repetition and trust on men knowing not just the words, but the intent behind them. The system lived entirely in their minds, carried from unit to unit, radio to radio. Training was relentless. Speed mattered as much as precision. Messages had to be encoded and decoded without pause, under stress, with lives depending on clarity. Errors were corrected through practice, not documentation. With lives depending on clarity, errors were corrected through practice, not documentation. Over time, fluency merged with procedure until the distinction disappeared. What emerged was something unprecedented, a human codebook, not a set of symbols, but a shared discipline. It could not be captured intact, it could not be studied in isolation. Its security depended not on secrecy alone, but on the improbability of replication. In the process, these men became something new. Service members first, linguists always, and operators of a system that defied classification. They carried no visible weapon of innovation, yet their voices would soon shape entire operations. As they prepared to deploy, few outside their teams understood what they had become. Fewer still grasped what it meant to turn a living language into an instrument of high-stakes coordination, one that would prove its worth, not in theory, but in seconds, measured under pressure. In live conditions, time revealed the true value of the system. Messages that once required minutes, sometimes longer under strain, were now encoded and decoded in seconds. A request for urgent assistance, a shift in position, a warning of approaching movement, all could be spoken, understood, and acted upon almost immediately. Communication no longer lagged behind events. It moved with them. There was no mechanical delay, no need to align rotors, consult tables, or verify keys. A voice carried intent directly from one mind to another. The radio became a conduit rather than a barrier, transmitting meaning as quickly as it could be spoken. In environments where seconds separated safety from loss, this difference mattered profoundly. Mistakes, when they occurred, did not paralyze the system. They were corrected conversationally. A phrase could be clarified, a term restated, without breaking rhythm or exposing structure. Unlike rigid encryption, which punished error with confusion, this method absorbed friction and moved on. It behaved less like a protocol and more like a dialogue, adaptive, resilient, and self-correcting. Chaos, instead of degrading performance, sharpened it. Under intense conditions, with heavy disruption and teams dispersing, the system proved strongest. Stress accelerated focus. Familiar language anchored clarity. While conventional communications faltered amid noise and urgency, these transmissions remained steady, precise, and fast. The human element, once considered a liability, became the stabilizing force. Radios ceased to feel like equipment. They became extensions of thought. Instructions were not processed, they were understood. The distance between coordination and action narrowed until it nearly vanished. Leaders could move with confidence, knowing their intent would arrive intact and on time. This speed changed behavior. Teams moved more decisively. Support was requested faster. Adjustments were made mid-action rather than after outcomes were known. The situation compressed, not in space, but in time. Decisions and consequences drew nearer to one another. For outside listeners, this acceleration was invisible. They heard the transmissions, they logged them, but by the time any response could be organized, the Americans had already acted and moved again. What once would have been a window for analysis became an empty interval. Tempo emerged as the defining advantage. Not secrecy in the traditional sense, not silence, but momentum sustained through communication that never paused long enough to be broken. The system did not seek to hide from anyone's ears. It simply refused to wait for their understanding. As operations expanded and pressure intensified, this tempo spread through American units like a quiet certainty. They were no longer reacting at the pace of events as they had been faced. They were setting a new pace altogether. And as that rhythm took hold across the region, it became clear that the advantage was no longer situational. It was systemic, reshaping how operations unfolded, and preparing the ground for moments when speed alone would decide who acted first, and who was left listening to words already out of date. By every conventional measure, opposing analysts had done their job. Intercepts were frequent, recordings were clear, equipment functioned as designed, and yet, understanding remained out of reach. The obstacle was not access, but comprehension. The language carried over the radios was unknown to trained linguists. It did not resemble any language commonly studied in those intelligence schools. There were no reference texts, no academic studies, no prior experience to draw upon. It existed entirely outside the analytical traditions brought to bear against it. Even those fluent in English gained no advantage. The transmissions did not rely on English grammar or vocabulary beneath the surface. English served only as a frame for the exchange, the language of procedure, not of meaning. Once the unfamiliar speech began, fluency ended. The words offered no recognizable anchors. What made the system especially resistant was its use of symbolism. Vocabulary was not literal, it did not describe objects directly, it evoked them. Meaning emerged through association rather than definition. A single term could reference shape, behavior, or cultural metaphor all at once. Without access to that cultural context, the words collapsed into sound. Context, in this system, was everything. Meaning depended on shared understanding between speaker and listener, an understanding built long before the war and carried into it. Without that foundation, even perfect audio fidelity was useless. Analysts could hear every syllable and still miss the message entirely. Repetition, the cornerstone of cryptanalysis, never arrived. Terms did not recur in predictable sequences. Messages were brief, situational, and immediately obsolete. There was no stable corpus to analyze, no gradual accumulation of data from which structure could be inferred. The system revealed nothing through endurance, because it was not designed to endure. Attempts to compensate through capture failed as well. Radios taken from the battlefield revealed nothing unusual. There were no modified components, no additional devices, no written aids tucked into packs or sewn into uniforms. Equipment that might have unlocked a mechanical cipher yielded only standard issue hardware. This absence was decisive. Without machines to study or documents to exploit, Japanese intelligence was left with nothing but sound, and sound, without context, was powerless. The system offered no fixed target, no artifact to dissect, no point of leverage. It existed only in the moment of exchange, then vanished. What made this failure so complete was that it did not announce itself. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden realization of defeat. Instead, the system simply remained beyond reach, battle after battle, resisting every tool applied to it. The code remained opaque not because it was cleverly hidden, but because it was never externalized. It lived in memory, in habit, in shared cultural logic. To break it would have required not better machines or more time, but an understanding of a people entirely outside Japan's experience. And by the time this reality could have been acknowledged, the war had moved on. American units were no longer just faster, they were predictably faster. The advantage had stabilized into something permanent. Japan continued to listen, but there was nothing left to learn. What began as an experiment soon followed the war itself, moving wherever the fighting grew most intense. From the jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, the voices carried by American radios became a constant presence, unseen, unrecorded, and increasingly decisive. The code talkers were no longer an anomaly. They were embedded in the rhythm of combat. On Guadalcanal, the terrain punished hesitation. Visibility was limited, movement uncertain, and engagements unfolded at close range. Here, rapid communication mattered more than firepower alone. Artillery support could be requested, adjusted, and redirected in moments. Fire missions landed where they were needed, when they were needed, often before Japanese units realized they had been detected. As operations expanded, the effect multiplied. American units maneuvered with a confidence that did not come from superior numbers, but from certainty of coordination. Orders arrived cleanly. Adjustments were immediate. Confusion so often the companion of battle was reduced, not eliminated, but managed. Japanese counterattacks still came. They were often well-planned, disciplined, and aggressive, but increasingly, they arrived late. Positions expected to be held were already vacated. Flanks thought secure had shifted. Assaults met defenses that had quietly reoriented in anticipation. The window between planning and execution had narrowed beyond usefulness. Tactical surprise, once rare and costly, became routine. At Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and onward, communication outpaced reaction. The Americans did not need to predict every move. They simply responded faster than their opponent could adapt. Each engagement reinforced the same pattern. Speed created initiative, and initiative created control. By the time the campaign reached Iwo Jima, the system was no longer novel. It was trusted. Amid one of the most ferocious battles of the Pacific War, where terrain offered little cover and resistance was relentless, communication remained fluid. Units adjusted under fire. Naval gunfire was coordinated precisely. Small gains were consolidated quickly, denying the enemy time to recover. The cumulative effect was subtle but relentless. There was no single moment where momentum visibly changed hands, no dramatic collapse. Instead, advantage accrued incrementally, battle after battle, decision after decision. The Americans were not just winning engagements, they were shaping the tempo at which those engagements occurred. For Japanese forces, the experience was disorienting. They faced an opponent who seemed always to know where to be, not through omniscience, but through speed. Plans unraveled not because they were flawed, but because they were overtaken by events. Communication had become more than support. It was operational power. As the war pressed closer to Japan itself, this power solidified into expectation. American commanders assumed rapid coordination as a given. Units moved with the assurance that understanding would travel with them, instant and intact. And in that assumption lay the turning point, not marked on maps, but carried on voices that moved faster than resistance, could form voices that had quietly transformed communication into momentum, and momentum into inevitability. By late 1944, Japanese units across the Pacific began to describe the same unease, using different words. It felt as though the enemy anticipated them, not in broad strategy, but in immediate intention. Movements were met before they matured. Adjustments were countered before they settled. The Americans did not appear omniscient. They appeared prepared. Ambushes that once promised surprise now dissolved into confusion. Patrols advanced expecting silence, only to meet fire from positions that should not yet have been occupied. Assaults planned under cover of darkness collided with defenses already aligned to receive them. The timing was wrong not catastrophically, but consistently. Defensive lines fared no better. Carefully constructed positions, intended to channel attackers into predictable approaches, were bypassed with unsettling precision. American units did not test every obstacle. They moved through the battlefield as if guided toward its weak points, avoiding strength and pressing where resistance was thinnest. At lower levels, the effect was immediate. Officers questioned assumptions that had once held firm. Plans were adjusted more frequently, then abandoned more quickly. Confidence in preparation began to erode not through defeat alone, but through the sense that preparation itself no longer guaranteed relevance. This erosion climbed the chain of command. Staff officers searched for explanations that fit existing doctrine. Perhaps reconnaissance had improved, perhaps aerial observation had grown more effective, perhaps espionage had penetrated command structures. Each theory was examined. None accounted for the speed with which American responses unfolded. Intelligence reports offered no clarity. Intercepts continued. Analysis continued. Yet the same contradiction remained. Information was being gathered, but it no longer translated into foresight. Knowing what the enemy had said did not reveal what the enemy would do. The battlefield began to feel asymmetric, not because of overwhelming force, but because of unequal understanding. Japanese commanders felt themselves reacting to events already in motion, always a step behind decisions made moments earlier. Orders were issued only to find conditions had changed before they arrived. This was not collapse, it was disorientation. Morale did not shatter, it thinned. The certainty that once underpinned planning confidence that careful preparation could shape outcomes faded quietly. Units fought with discipline and resolve, but increasingly without expectation. Initiative narrowed. Risk was avoided. Momentum slipped away, not in dramatic defeats, but in lost opportunities. What troubled commanders most was the absence of error on the American side. Not perfection, but consistency. The Americans adjusted smoothly. They did not appear to hesitate or overcorrect. Their movements suggested coordination at a level invisible to the observer, linking actions across distance and terrain without pause. This perception, accurate or not, had consequences. When an enemy appears always to know, every move feels exposed, decision-making becomes cautious, surprise becomes improbable. The psychological advantage shifts long before territory does. By the time senior officers acknowledged that something fundamental had changed, the realization arrived without a solution. There was no new system to attack, no doctrine to counter, no clear vulnerability to exploit. The imbalance could be felt, but not defined. And so the erosion continued, not through shock, but through certainty slipping away. Confidence did not vanish, it drained, and in its absence, the battlefield grew quieter, more constrained, governed less by intention than by reaction. The Americans had not become unbeatable, but they had become difficult to surprise. And in war, that difference is often enough. Faced with a growing imbalance, Japanese command did not remain idle. The evidence was undeniable. American coordination was outpacing response at every level. Orders arrived sooner, adjustments followed faster. Something fundamental had shifted, and doctrine demanded an answer. Efforts to accelerate code development began quietly but urgently. New encryption procedures were proposed. Existing systems were refined. Engineers worked to compress steps, to shave seconds from transmission and decoding. On paper, progress appeared steady. In practice, the battlefield imposed limits no design could overcome. Mechanical encryption remained slow under fire. Devices required setup and verification. Operators needed time to align components, to confirm accuracy, to avoid fatal errors. In calm conditions, the delays were tolerable. In combat, they compounded. Shellfire disrupted concentration. Movement interrupted procedure. A secure message that arrived late still arrived too late. Training offered no shortcut. Crews drilled relentlessly, but speed gained through repetition plateaued quickly. Machines did not think faster under stress. They did not simplify themselves when conditions deteriorated. Human operators adapted, but the systems they served did not. The Americans, meanwhile, were not accelerating in the same way. Their advantage did not depend on refinement. It depended on fluency. Each battle strengthened familiarity. Each engagement reinforced habits already formed. Communication did not improve because it was redesigned, but because it was used. This difference mattered. Japanese planners recognized the problem but misjudged its nature. They sought to copy results rather than causes. Faster machines, tighter procedures, more training hours. What they could not replicate was the absence of machinery, altogether the removal of steps, rather than their optimization. Even when new systems entered service, they entered late. Field conditions exposed weaknesses immediately. Delays returned. Friction reasserted itself. The Americans continued to move first, not because they knew more, but because they acted sooner. With each battle, the gap widened. Not dramatically, incrementally, a minute gained here, a hesitation avoided there. Over time, these margins accumulated into expectation. American commanders assumed responsiveness as a constant. Japanese commanders learned to expect delay. Adaptation, when it came, arrived after momentum had shifted. New procedures faced troops already fatigued, already under pressure, already conditioned by losses. Learning curves flattened where urgency was greatest. The opportunity to experiment safely had passed. What emerged was not a temporary advantage, but a structural one. The American system could not be captured, studied, or reverse-engineered. It left no artifact to steal, no blueprint to replicate. It depended on a convergence of language, trust, and training that could not be assembled quickly, even if it were understood fully. By the final year of the war, the imbalance had stabilized into permanence. Communication superiority no longer needed to prove itself. It was assumed. Battles were planned with it in mind. Operations unfolded within its reach. Japan did not lose because it failed to innovate. It lost because innovation arrived, constrained by doctrine and time. The Americans had crossed a threshold, first one where speed was not an enhancement, but the foundation. Once crossed, it could not be chased down. The advantage had become invisible, embedded in routine, indistinguishable from competence itself. And in that invisibility lay its final strength. It no longer looked like a weapon. It looked like the way war was fought now. When the war ended, it did so loudly. Sirens, celebrations, surrender documents, and headlines marked the conclusion of global conflict. But the system that had helped shape victory in the Pacific did not share in that noise. When the radios fell silent, so did the men whose voices had carried so much of the war's weight. There was no public acknowledgement. No press briefing explained how American units had coordinated so quickly, or why Japanese forces had so often arrived too late. The method remained absent from official narratives, folded quietly back into classification. What had been decisive in battle became invisible in peace. The code talkers were ordered to remain silent. The instruction was direct and unambiguous. The system might be needed again. Its effectiveness depended on secrecy beyond the battlefield. They were not to discuss their work, not with journalists, not with neighbors, not even with family members. The war had ended, but the obligation endured. For decades, their contribution remained classified. The men returned home carrying experiences they could not explain. Some resumed lives interrupted years earlier. Others navigated a country that celebrated victory without understanding the role they had played in securing it. Medals were scarce. Recognition was absent. Silence filled the space where explanation might have been. The code itself was never broken. Not during the war. Not afterward. No captured documents revealed it. No post-war intelligence assessments reconstructed it fully. Its success remained intact, preserved not by continued use, but by continued absence from record. Unlike machines that could be archived or analyzed, this system left little behind. As years passed, its impact became abstract. Histories described, battles won, positions held, momentum gained. Communication was acknowledged as important, but rarely examined at the level where seconds decided outcomes. The voices that had carried those seconds were largely unmentioned. Silence became part of the story. For the code talkers, that silence was not symbolic. It was lived. Their service existed in memory rather than narrative, in personal recollection rather than public history. The system they had embodied had worked precisely because it left no trace, and that same quality delayed its recognition. When classification finally lifted decades later, the revelation came quietly. By then, many of the men were old. Some were gone. The code was acknowledged, honored, and commemorated, but in a world far removed from the urgency that had given it meaning. Even then, its true significance resisted simplification. It was not merely a clever solution or a linguistic curiosity. It was an idea ahead of its time, that communication could be a weapon not by being hidden forever, but by moving faster than it could be challenged. In the end, the radios fell silent, and the war moved into memory. But the silence that followed was not empty. It held a lesson about speed, trust, and the power of human systems that leave no footprint. And for years, that lesson waited, unheard, carried only by those who had once spoken into static and changed the course of battles without ever being named. Throughout the Pacific War, Japanese intelligence searched for answers where it had always found them before, in machines, methods, and measurable systems. They examined frequencies, catalogued transmissions, refined analytical models, and trusted that with sufficient data, the enemy's advantage would reveal itself. This approach had history behind it. It had worked in earlier conflicts. It felt reliable. But the solution they sought did not exist in hardware. The advantage was human and cultural, shaped long before the war and carried into it without modification. It was not built in factories or laboratories. It did not require engineers to maintain it or technicians to calibrate it. It relied on memory, shared meaning, and a discipline rooted in people rather than procedures. Language, in this context, proved stronger than mathematics. Japanese doctrine assumed that meaning could always be reduced to symbols, to numbers, to systems that could be solved if studied long enough. But this system resisted reduction. It did not expose structure through repetition. It did not weaken under sustained observation. It lived in nuance, metaphor, and speed, beyond the reach of conventional analysis. Speed defeated intelligence. Not because intelligence failed to listen, but because listening no longer led to understanding in time to matter. Intercepts arrived intact and precise, yet relevance expired before conclusions could form. The enemy was not hiding information. They were exhausting its value. This inversion mattered deeply. Intelligence had always assumed that access equaled power. Here, access became irrelevant. Without the ability to act within the same temporal window, knowledge lost its force. The Americans did not need to deny information. They denied time. Trust replaced complexity. Instead of layering security upon security, the system simplified itself. It placed confidence in individuals trained to act under pressure, to adapt instantly, and to communicate without hesitation. This trust reduced friction. It eliminated steps. It allowed meaning to flow without obstruction. Doctrines struggled to accommodate this reality. Japanese planners valued precision, hierarchy, and proven method. These qualities had served them well in earlier stages of the war. But adaptability, especially adaptability that challenged foundational assumptions, proved harder to cultivate under strain. Innovation arrived, but it arrived constrained by what doctrine allowed it to be. War, however, rewarded adaptability over doctrine. The Americans did not win because they were more disciplined, or more intelligent, or more technologically advanced in every domain. They won because they were willing, at a critical moment, to abandon an assumption that secrecy must always come before speed, and to accept uncertainty in exchange for momentum. This lesson did not arrive through defeat alone. It arrived indirectly, encoded in outcomes rather than explanations. Japanese commanders felt the imbalance long before they could name it. By the time it could be articulated, it could no longer be reversed. The tragedy of this misunderstanding was not that it went unrecognized during the war, but that it revealed something timeless. Systems built solely on control and calculation struggle when confronted with human complexity used deliberately. In the end, Japan never understood the code because it was not a code in the way they imagined. It was a philosophy of communication, expressed through language and trust, moving faster than analysis could follow. And when the war was over, the lesson remained quiet, indirect, and easy to miss, waiting for those willing to see that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not hidden behind layers of secrecy, but carried openly, spoken once, and gone before anyone realizes it was there. In the end, there was no blueprint to recover, no diagram to study after the smoke cleared. The system that had carried American intent across jungles and beaches left nothing behind for history to catalogue. It existed without schematics, without written doctrine, without a physical center of gravity. When the war ended, it did not retire into museums or archives. It simply stopped speaking. What sustained it was not invention, but discipline. Memory replaced machinery. Trust replaced redundancy. The men who carried it were trained not to consult references, but to rely on one another to speak clearly, listen completely, and act without delay. In an era increasingly defined by mechanical solutions, this was a return to something older and more fragile: human reliability under pressure. That fragility was also its strength, because there was nothing to seize, no document to translate, no device to reverse engineer. Even when radios were captured, they revealed nothing unusual. The enemy could hear every word and still possess nothing. The system offered no handle by which it could be pulled apart. Japan never knew what guided American movement. They could observe outcomes units arriving sooner than expected, defenses shifting just in time, attacks unfolding with precision, but the cause remained elusive. From the outside, it appeared as intuition, or luck, or superior planning. The quiet truth was simpler and harder to accept. Understanding was traveling faster than reaction. The advantage existed only in the moment spoken. Once a message was delivered and acted upon, it lost all value. There was no residue. Nothing lingered long enough to be analyzed. The system denied the enemy not access, but opportunity. It did not conceal meaning. It consumed it. This inversion challenges how war is often remembered. We speak of secrecy, deception, and hidden knowledge as the foundations of advantage. But here, victory flowed from clarity, rather than concealment from communication so fast and so fluid that secrecy became unnecessary. War, in this case, was decided by understanding. Not understanding the enemy, but understanding one another, understanding that speed could outrun interception, that language could carry intent more faithfully than machines, that human systems, when trusted and trained, could outperform engineered ones in environments defined by chaos. The lesson extends beyond the Pacific War. It suggests that complexity is not always strength. That doctrine can blind as easily as it can guide. That the most effective systems are sometimes those that appear simplest, because their sophistication lies not in design, but in use. They tried to break the code. They listened, they recorded, they analyzed. They searched for patterns, machines, mistakes. They never realized that there was nothing to break in the way they imagined. The system did not fail under pressure because it was never rigid enough to fracture. It was alive, carried in voices, sustained by memory, gone as soon as it was spoken. And in that fleeting existence, in words that moved faster than comprehension, lay one of the quiet truths of modern war, that sometimes the most powerful weapon leaves no trace, no proof, and no explanation behind. Only outcomes, only silence, only the knowledge, discovered too late, that what you were trying to break was never a thing at all but a living force, already gone.